Hi folks, it's Thinking Slow here. Wanted to do a quick episode about Bucha, but not about what actually went on there because I don't think anyone is 100% certain, but more about the Western reaction to the photos and pictures that have been coming out of there. I think that's more important to understand the context and how this is being used in this information war that we're in the middle of. And if you're wondering, this picture is a picture of World War One propaganda, and we'll cover that in this presentation. So starting off basically on the Western side, the West has obviously a fairly long history of false narratives and situations that have been used by our dishonest governments to start and expand wars. So when they jump on something like Bucha, I think the first thing to do is to exercise a fair degree of skepticism. So here we got the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The second incident was acknowledged to be fake. Later on, the Iraq War, number one, there was a long story which we covered in one of the other videos about Iraqi soldiers stealing Kuwaiti incubators and leaving babies on the floor. That was also completely fake. Obviously, the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq too are the one is the situation that most people know about, and the Douma chemical attack. There was a lot of inconsistencies there, and all of that was essentially deleted from the report justifying the war. So there's a long history of the Western governments either manufacturing situations or misrepresenting them in order to justify military action. So we have to trust the government a lot less than we did in the past, I think. The other obvious fact is that from Ukraine, almost every story that comes out of there gets debunked as being false pretty quickly. So already we've got the Snake Island incident. We have the Ghost of Kiev incident. We have the sort of the tank flattening a car, which turned out to be a Ukrainian tank and not a Russian tank. We've got the video that we showed in one of the other films about the soldiers pointing guns at unarmed civilians. That turns out to have been from 2017 and was actually Ukrainian military pointing guns at unarmed civilians. And so on and so forth, essentially. So a lot of stuff coming out of Ukraine is well, at best misrepresented, and at worst it's completely wrong. It's 180 degrees wrong. So any sensible person wouldn't jump on some images coming out of Ukraine and use that to sort of be judge and jury and executioner just based on pictures from a regime that we know is corrupt and has broken all kinds of rules, including conducting war crimes in the past. But, having said all that, of course, the media and the Western politicians have jumped on those Bucha pictures, taken them as being 100% valid, and is now sort of busily accusing Russia of war crimes. Here is the if you're interested, actually is a tweet from today, which actually has a short video clip that proves that the whole Iraq War number one episode about the stolen incubators was completely fake, and it was actually created by a US PR company. So that's on the Twitter feed if you want it, but. Let's have a look at the accounts that are most vociferous in accusing Russia of war crimes just based on those pictures out of Bucha. And we've looked at some of these before, but what we've done is we've just traced the sources of funding back to where the funding is from, and we covered that a little bit in one of the other videos too. But starting with the Atlantic Council, Anders Osland has been a hyperactive tweeter, and we'll look at a couple of things he said. We've looked at them in the past, but we sort of mentioned it there. But one thing across all of these tweeting accounts who are all jumping on the Bucha story is every single one of them is funded to some extent by the US Department of State. Most of them are funded directly. A couple of them are funded through USAID or the US Embassy in Kiev. So the source of funding is the same for all of these accounts to some extent, which is the US Department of State, which is obviously very antagonistic towards Russia at the moment. The next interest group behind these two, Atlantic Council and the Centre for European Policy Analysis, is the military-industrial complex. And as we'll see, obviously, the military-industrial complex has a huge vested interest in increasing tensions with Russia. So, when you see this kind of name, Centre for European Policy Analysis, it's a meaningless title, but if you look back, you'll see through this chart the sources of funding. So here we've got the US State Department, we've got a fair bit of military-industrial complex through these black lines. And then also in the Atlantic Council you have the Victor Pinchuk Foundation, and we'll have a little bit at Victor Pinchuk, but he's the son-in-law of the former Ukrainian president, so definitely not neutral. And probably most significantly of all, in the Atlantic Council you have this foundation, which name doesn't tell you anything, Future of Russian Foundation. But as we saw in one of the other videos, this is actually funded by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's a convicted criminal in Russia, and he's also one of Putin's, or probably Putin's, most vociferous enemies. So, you look at the sources of funding for this, and they have agendas basically, and that funding may be related, may not be related to what Mr. Osland's saying, but he is a fellow of this Atlantic Council. And as I hinted, this Centre for European Policy Analysis is a sort of junior version of the Atlantic Council. So this has a budget about $37 million per year for lobbying. I mean, a fairly enormous amount of money. This one is about $4 million roughly, and is very similar funding base. The exception here is that they don't have this foundation in the Centre for European Policy Analysis, but again, it's Victor Pinchuk, military-industrial complex, and US Department of State, along with other governments. Then we get to these accounts now. These are sort of in-country, pure Ukrainian domestic NGOs, and again, they never disclose really anything about their funding when they're tweeting, so you're just looking at these sort of fairly names that don't really mean anything. Center for Civil Liberties, what does that mean? Someone called Medvedchuk, and then if you look back through the sources of funding, again, as I said, it's the US Department of State which funds all of these, and this is then linked in with the Soros Open Society Foundations. And again, same, here's another one, Kalinyuk, Anti-Corruption Research and Education. What does that mean? Who knows? But again, it's funded by the US Department of State, the same as all the other ones, and George Soros through the Open Society Foundation. And again, he is coming in with some very fixed political ideas about what should and shouldn't happen. So we'll come on to that a bit, but what I'm trying to say is when you see these tweets, and all of these have hundreds of thousands of followers, I think they're quite amplified through Twitter, through the algorithms. Basically, you have funding for all of them from the US Department of State, and then across them you see a sort of similar type of pattern of military-industrial complex plus an oligarch, or in this case just the US Department of State plus an oligarch. But in all cases, people who are sort of players, I guess if you could say that, with a very strong political view on this situation, and most of them, I would say, pretty vehemently opposed to Russia. So I think it's slightly naive to imagine that doesn't affect their tweeting. And again, they tweet all negative things on Russia, of course, but they've particularly picked up on this Bucha situation. No need for any verification, analysis, anything. Russia's guilty of war crimes, let's go. And as I said, behind those organizations and those facades, this is the funding structure. And we'll write this up into a note and post it as well. just before leaving that, this is the vested interest we discussed in the military-industrial complex, which is a big funder for the Atlantic Council. So three of the world's four largest military or defense contractors are funders of the Atlantic Council, and look at these share price movements. If you translate that into dollars, for Northrop, that is about $15 billion worth of increased market capitalization over the last 2 or 3 months. So if you're paying for lobbying, and your lobbying is increasing tensions with Russia, that can be a pretty profitable situation for you. So I think in today's world, you cannot ignore the fact that there are these conflicted interests, and this funding is sitting behind the Atlantic Council. So this is Victor Pinchuk. He's funding both the Atlantic Council and the other organization, SEPA. I don't know politically too much, but he's also funding the Clinton Foundation, and his main claim to fame is being the son-in-law of the ex-president of Ukraine and a billionaire in his own right, and also the plaintiff and defendant on numerous lawsuits about asset stripping and all kinds of other things. Again, without commenting on any outcome of those claims, just saying that those claims do exist, and we've looked at them in previous episodes. But he's, again, a player, in inverted commas, in this whole Ukrainian-Russian mess. So, he has a view on what's going on, and it seems slightly unlikely that view won't filter its way through into organizations that he funds. Of course, they will say they're completely independent, but you just have to take a value judgment on how true that is, basically. So, well, here is one other account from Twitter. This is Andrew Neil, who's not involved in those NGOs, but he's on his own. He's regularly tweeting out a lot of anti-Russian propaganda, and I was wondering when we saw this whether this is could partly explain that. Here he is in January 2020 promoting investment in Ukraine, sitting with Ukrainian politicians at a side event from the World Economic Forum in Davos in something called the Ukraine House. And I think this alone would make it so that he's not fully independent, and as I said with the other individuals, he probably has an angle or skin in the game in terms of supporting Ukraine. And actually he supports most sort of global agenda items to do with vaccine passports and all kinds of other things. So, that's to be determined. But he's another one who will immediately jump on any bandwagon. No need for proof, no need for evidence. It's Russian war crimes, punish them more. Let's expand this conflict, send in more weapons, etc., etc. And that may be partly driven by this relationship that he has here. But who knows? But it's worth raising. So I think to some extent, our conclusion is the same, that it's sort of this aggressive, irrational, deep state Washington that quite often is the problem in these situations. And this tweet of Osland's, I think, is a classic in response to the way that the people of Hungary chose to vote. So he's saying if Hungary really votes overwhelmingly against democracy and for corruption, I cannot see why it should be accepted in the EU. Kick it out. So again, rather than showing any respect whatsoever for the democratic vote of the people of Hungary, his first response is to punish them. They haven't done what I wanted them to do. How can they be punished? Kick them out of the EU. This is the thing with these people. They're ultra-aggressive, irrational, and have no respect for the actual process of democracy. And many people pointed out this is kind of ludicrous paradox of his statement here. They voted overwhelmingly against democracy, completely ridiculous turn of phrase. But, I think, and we've seen these people are really a big problem, and I think they're behind a lot of the tensions everywhere, to be honest, and particularly in this Ukraine-Russia situation as well. And as I said in one of the other videos, I think for us, one of the main issues here is that Putin has turned his back quite vocally on this sort of woke, one world government, neo-Marxist agenda. And this speech now has been blitzed from YouTube, but it is very clear that we don't want this. We do not want this woke agenda. It doesn't belong in Russia. One world government doesn't belong in Russia. Destroying your history doesn't belong in Russia. And this is a conservative small c country, and this is the real sin. This is why these hotheads, aggressive people like Osland and all the others won't tolerate Russia. Of course, there's other reasons as well, but this is, I think, one of the main reason behind a lot of this hatred. There's no other way of describing it. It is pure hatred at this stage. And it's not reciprocated as far as I can work out. I'm watching Russian news and reading Russian papers. I don't see it the other way around. I mean, it will get to that point eventually, but right now this is rabid hatred from the West towards Russia and anything to do with Russia. And as we've seen, the ludicrous cancelling of composers and writers and artists, and it's completely deranged, and it's driven by people like Osland, who are a nuisance. And then just finishing up, what we also see with this outrage expressed by the West, it's very, very selective. So I think people may have been aware of this footage of Russian prisoners of war being shot while bound. Ukraine never really attempted to deny this. I mean, it's truly awful, this piece of footage, truly, truly awful. And one of many horrendous bits of video coming out of Ukraine, not least of which is also the tying people up to lampposts all over. And this is just completely ignored. There's no outrage, nothing, no war crimes, no investigation, that just sweep it under the carpet. And Russian military intelligence has intercepted some conversations between Ukraine and UK about how to deal with the fallout from this. So it's not even, it's seemingly likely that this is genuine, and that would fit in with Arestovich's reminder to troops to stick to the Geneva Convention, which implies again that they've been breaching the Geneva Convention. So when you see this and zero response, you realize the West is not really about principles. It's just about political brinksmanship. It's not about principles, because if it was about principles, there would be a massive outcry about this, and there's been absolutely nothing. These people do not have principles. They just have their own preferences, and they will bully and jump up and down and cause trouble if their personal preferences are not met. That's all it is. And then just sort of wrapping up, one of the other reasons I wanted to do the tracing those NGOs back to vested interests is, I think everybody, I would imagine at this stage, post-pandemic, is getting the idea that a lot of government has been captured by vested interests, particularly the oligarchy and business interests. And we certainly saw that in COVID, and we did a lot of work on tracing funding back to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other things that went on, that our regulators are actually cooperating with pharmaceutical companies as well. And that's not a wild conspiracy theory. People will try and dismiss any investigation of those links as sort of crazy, but there's a lot of evidence now of this. And here is one good paper. It relies on multivariate analysis, which is sort of quite a lot of maths in order to prove something that seems reasonably intuitive. But the maths actually points that economic elites and organized groups representing business have substantial impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. And this is quite a long paper, but it basically telling you that the rules today are written for the benefit of the oligarchy and corporate interests. They're not written for your benefit and my benefit. And increased military spending is a classic. That will benefit, as we've seen, the military-industrial complex and everyone working in it, but it will have zero benefit for people because there's no utility for an extra tank sitting in a field somewhere. That's got no utility at all for people. And I think this we saw in COVID. I think we're seeing it again, that the whole policy position is being driven by these vested interests, because I don't know really anyone that thinks it's a good idea to risk World War III for the sake of fighting in Ukraine. Ukraine is very, very far from being a perfect country, and it's corrupt. It's had a history of war crimes, etc., etc. So it's only really the deep state who are so ultra aggressive and prepared to push all the way up to World War III, because Russia has not gone the way that they wanted, I think, is the bottom line. And that's very dangerous. I think ordinary people are not so keen to get into World War III as these hotheads are in deep state Washington. So that was it, really. I think this is a cartoon that came out. This is for the UK. But I imagine quite a few people are beginning to feel this way, that the domestic national politics is all a bit of a theatre, because ultimately a lot of roads are leading back to these organisations, and here's just some of them are listed, basically coming back to a new world order. But that certainly seems to be the case if you look at the way policies are actually made. There really isn't that much involvement from MPs. This is all done through, as we looked at, those think tanks. Think tanks then are funded by somebody else, and that funding comes with strings attached and vested interests. And I think this is becoming a reality, and I said that academic paper proves that, really, that most policy making is done for the benefit of vested elites and not for the benefit of people. And this is the cartoon illustrating that. So just wrapping up then, I think for us at least, the long history of disinformation used by the West and the fake news coming out of Ukraine means that Bucha, you'd have to assume that's not true unless you get evidence to the contrary, that there's some independently verified facts, and if there are those facts, then they need to be dealt with, obviously. But jumping on the bandwagon and screaming blue murder and insisting on an instant punishment is very, very stupid, actually. I think the other thing that we saw was that the way that the shooting of bound Russian POWs was completely ignored shows this isn't about principles. This is just about dirty politics of the deep state in Washington wishing to arrange a regime change in Russia. That's all they're interested in. They don't care about principles. That's definitely my impression. And we'll look at another one of these guys, Tom Tugendhat, tomorrow, probably, what he's been on about. And really at the end, certainly Russia invaded, so Russia's got a case to answer here, but our view is, at a minimum, the deep state Washington has contributed as a minimum, but I think actually they have triggered this war probably deliberately, and hopefully this will be one of the last wars that the deep state can really trigger, because I think they're figuring out now that China's having none of it, and India's having none of it. On Bucha, they're saying, let's get the evidence, let's see what happened, but let's importantly get this war finished as soon as possible. Let's get peace talks going, let's have a ceasefire. Now, the West is doing the opposite of that. The West is looking for ways to inflame this war and actually have it come out worse. So, this could be the end of the road. I hope it's the end of the road for a lot of these deep state actors, because they are really a problem. Okay, hope you found this reasonably interesting, and we'll write a note actually about those financial links between the US Department of State and those NGOs that we looked at in the beginning, and we'll put those numbers in the note as well. Okay, thanks. Bye.